everybody. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different from usual because I was going to have a new interview for you, but unfortunately the guest fell through. So instead I'm going to do what I do occasionally, which is put out an episode full of highlights from episodes in the distant past, namely, in this case, episodes 26 through 30. And those came out in late 2018, early 2019. So this episode will be audio only as I hadn't incorporated video into the podcast yet. So just to give you a brief overview of what you'll hear in this episode, you're going to be hearing me discussing ideology, feminism, and modesty with Abigail Favale. You're going to hear the Dominican priest, Father Basil Cole, on the relationship of temperance to contemplation of art. You're going to hear a bit of the great Catholic poet Samuel Hazel, who I recently had on for episode 100, discussing Jacques Meritan's account of the role of intuition and love in the making of poetry. You'll hear a short clip from Scott Hambrick of Online Great Books, and then we'll end with a segment about Tolkien's visual art. So to introduce each of these clips, I will read the description of the episode and give you a little bit of context for the clip that I'm taking out. And of course, I will link to each full episode in the show notes for this episode in case you want to listen to the whole original episode. And I'm hardly an unbiased source, but I think they're all worth listening to still. So because it's one of the most popular episodes I've ever done, and it's always one of my most popular topics whenever I cover it, I'm going to start with episode 29, Catholic Feminism, Should We? With Abigail Ryan Favale. Here's the description. Today, there is more pressure than ever before on both women and men to embrace feminism. In her memoir, Into the Deep, Abigail Ryan Favale gives a resonant account of her journey from an evangelical childhood to a Christian feminism, which inevitably gave way to the secular postmodern variety. This ideology gradually gutted her faith, a process interrupted by childbirth and a sudden and unexpected conversion to Catholicism. We discuss the feasibility of Catholic feminism, the danger of interpreting doctrine through a predetermined ideological hermeneutic, facile uses of the word equality, the totalizing nature of all ideology, the role of intuition in the spiritual life, and more. So, as I mentioned, this remains one of my most popular episodes, and it's also the episode that I have gotten most criticism for by far. And I should add, specifically for my part of it, Abigail was not criticized by the people who emailed me, but I was. And I think fairly so to a certain extent. And if you want to know more about that, I added a little bit of introduction to the original episode, kind of explaining the criticism and why I thought it was somewhat justified. So in this first of two clips, Abigail and I discuss feminism as an ideology and specifically the question of whether ideology itself might be a bad thing, even aside from the specific content of any given ideology.
Should we try to articulate an authentically Catholic version of feminism, or should we try to move away from feminism altogether? Because I can understand the pros and cons on each of those approaches. And so it's something I'm trying to figure out in my own life and my own thought, I guess, because I'm comfortable leaving the term feminism behind, the label behind. I think Catholic is the only label I need in terms of a worldview. But at the same time, I think because feminism has such cultural power right now, like you were mentioning, that perhaps it's also good for there to be an authentically Catholic version of feminism on offer, I suppose, especially for young women who are really wrestling with these questions and who perhaps are attracted to feminism for one reason or another.
Well, I mean, it's the same question as with any ideology. I think we're having the same conversation about liberalism right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a big topic in the Catholic world. But it's interesting to me looking at the history because there's this kind of narrative among the Catholic feminists that, well, feminism was all great and totally compatible with Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And the first feminists were pro-life. You know, it was just when those darn radicals took over. So the radicals become like the scapegoat so that the earlier parts of feminism can be saved. But then you have Edith Stein saying that she didn't think what would have been basically, I don't know, the first wave, I think, of feminism at her time. She didn't think it was compatible at the root with what she called the Christian women's movement. So maybe that would be a better way of putting it. And also, you have the benefit of being a movement rather than an ideology, right? There is a difference.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And, even the term feminism itself can imply a certain hierarchy, I guess, between the sexes, or even play into the kind of competitive dynamic between men and women, which ultimately I don't think is helpful.
Yeah.
Or Christian. Yeah. So I think you're exactly right. So I think that's that typical tale of the sort of original feminism and then the fall, of feminism into original sin or something. I think that's overly simplistic, because you do already, even in the first wave, have a kind of different understanding perhaps of the human person and the relation between the human person and the worldview. There's more overlap, I would say, but I do think that's a simplistic narrative.
But of course, you could say there's more overlap with the, original Enlightenment than there is with
Right.
the modern version,
Right.
But that's just how these things work.
But one thing you bring up Edith Stein. And so one thing that has been surprising to me as I've made my way into Catholicism is the richness of thought on the question of woman, especially in the 20th century among Catholic theologians and philosophers. And I think that the average Catholic doesn't know that it's certainly not in the feminist scene and women's studies at all. There's this whole line of thought that's, you've got Edith Stein, you've got Dietrich von Hildebrand, you've got Hans Urs von Balthasar, you've got Gertrude von Lefort, of course, John Paul II, Adrian von Speer. So you have all these rich minds thinking about this very question in very profound ways. And it's just not on the radar at all in sort of the secular feminist women's studies world. But I think the average Catholic doesn't know that it's there either.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, how can we bring those rich resources to the fore, especially for young Catholic women, to say, look, there is a rich tradition on this question in our church.
Yeah.
That actually has more fruitful things, I think, to say about women than secular feminism does.
Sure.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's doable, and it doesn't require the packaging of an ideology. It's just, let's explore this truth, and it's not like you need some way to make it relevant, because it is relevant.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, I don't think that's going to be all you have to do is, put in the work, but I think people are starving for that. So I don't think it's going to be an issue as far as like convincing people to pay attention within the church.
Right. So it sounds like what you're coming from the perspective that one can bring these questions to the forefront without actually calling it Catholic feminism.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, it's partially a question about the details of feminism itself and partially about ideology. I think ideology in general is dangerous. And ultimately,
Right.
Well, look, one of the first really things that struck me in your book was your description of what you called your own personal waves of Christian feminism, which was first. So you started out as an evangelical, then in college, I guess you started identifying yourself as a Christian feminist. And first you started out trying to make the Bible fit your presumption of egalitarianism. And so you would treat the Bible as though it had divine authority, but basically make yourself, as you put it, like the guardian of proper feminist interpretation. Eventually you realized that wasn't going to work. And so what some people might do in that situation is say, well, okay, I guess I can't be a feminist then. That's what I did with libertarianism. But in your case, and in certainly the case of many others, it was this sort of slippery slope to eventually saying, well, if the Bible clashes with feminism, then, the Bible must be wrong. It must be a collection of texts that are of purely human origin.
Yes.
And you go into the book about this process of basically trying to rescue these little nuggets of like what you thought the true core of the story was, shedding all of this patriarchal stuff surrounding it. So I think that's like a problem with ideologies in general, in that they are these like totalizing solutions that are ultimately, even if you just try to take a little part of it, just the way that they frame things tends to grow. You know what I mean? It tends to always want to totalize. So if you're taking a little part of a totalizing system, that little part is still shaped by the overall ideology. Then with feminism in particular, and this is actually true of, I guess, probably a great many modern ideologies are based on this, but egalitarianism seems to be the central question.
Right.
A few days ago, I was browsing some feminist Catholic website, and was an article or a blog post on there, and the person was, talking about, why feminists should be Catholic. And it was like, all feminism is what the church teaches, that men and women are equal. And they had
A tiny little snippet of the catechism in quotes, so I looked up the passage.
what it actually said was men and women are equal as persons, but as men and women, they're complementary, which is it's a very different statement.
Yeah.
My observation of feminism and my thought about it over the past couple of years, it brought me more and more towards a rejection of egalitarianism. People seem to think you can say different but equal. Like, okay, so a Catholic feminist will want to say, well, yes, men and women are different. They may or may not like to use the word complementary depending on the person. They'll say men and women are different, but they're equal. Well, okay, equal to what? Equal as what? Because how can you possibly, if they are different qua man, qua woman, how is it possible to come up with some kind of mathematical equation? You can't really say things are equal qua their difference.
Yeah, exactly. You have to specify what the equality is attached to, right? So maybe equal in terms of dignity while also being significantly different.
Right. Even if you have good intentions and maybe you don't even realize you're doing this, the ideology is already making you slide over a kind of important point.
Right. And that reminds me a lot of how I used to think as an evangelical feminist, because I didn't realize I was doing it. But what I was doing was my primary sort of foundation, I suppose, was the feminist ideology. And then I was sort of arguing that, hey, Christianity fits this, right? So the standard is kind of feminism and then saying, oh, look, you can see this in Christianity, right? Instead of the other way around, where you start from a Christian perspective and then look at feminism from that vantage point and say, okay, is any of this really compatible with the Christian worldview? If so, which parts? How would that look like? I mean, I'm really struck by your point that ideologies tend toward totalizing narratives, because I think you're right. And that's what's happened certainly in my own journey. And so, one thing I do wonder in terms of trying to articulate a Catholic feminism, I worry sometimes that Christian versions of feminism are kind of gateways to secular feminism. So you kind of start out maybe in this middle ground where you're still holding on to some Christian principles or concepts, but then eventually that ground is sort of seeded into a really secular feminist framework, which is sort of what happened to me. So this is the only sort of conclusion I've come to recently, which is you can be a Catholic feminist, but you have to be a heretic. You can either be a feminist heretic and an Orthodox Catholic, or you can be an Orthodox feminist and a heretical Catholic.
Right.
So that's the only sort of conclusion I've come to so far. So that any version of, say, Catholic feminism, or even if you want to ditch the word feminism and say a Catholic women's movement, anything like that, from a secular feminist vantage point, is going to look very heretical. It's going to be rejecting certain key presuppositions that secular feminism takes for granted.
Sure.
So I do feel very clear about that, because I'm with you. I do think there is a danger for sort of watered down versions of Christian feminism, or Christian feminisms that are only nominally Christian and then just become easy segues into a very secular account of the world and the human person. So, because it's going to look significantly different. It really is, from the ground up. If it's even possible to have a Catholic feminism, it's going to look significantly different. And it's probably going to be, in some cases, kind of repulsive to many secular feminists. It's not going to be on board with some very, very key ideas. Particularly, I think the emphasis on autonomy as being the ideal and the key to a woman's freedom, because that is going to set a woman at war with herself and her own body, her own fertility.
Here's the second shorter clip. Abigail and I discuss the feminist rejection of modesty as being possibly a species of pride rather than a manifestation of lust.
It's interesting. You were just talking about autonomy. That is a really big deal. One of the first things I was talking about my progression of thinking on this issue, one of the first things I saw that gave me pause among self-described Catholic feminists was an undue desire for autonomy on the issue of modesty. Okay, so in your book, you criticize aspects of evangelical purity culture that should be criticized, and there are certainly aspects of what could be called modesty culture, or the way some people approach it, that could be criticized. But in the cases I was observing, these people were not debating what the standard should be. They were essentially denying that there should be a standard at all. And the issue was not, what was really interesting to me was some of these women, I could tell their goal was not to be able to wear a bikini. Like, that wasn't the issue for them. The issue was not they wanted to wear something and they thought they weren't being allowed to wear it. The issue was, I should not be beholden to, they're thinking, a man in terms of what I wear. I should not be beholden to men I should not have a moral responsibility. And of course, you and I know that's not the sum of what modesty is, right? But the fact is this, and I see this with a lot of issues in feminism in general, not just this one. There's this idea that women are being asked to do something that other people are not being asked to do. A burden is being put on women. But the thing is, everybody as a Christian has responsibility to not be a stumbling block to their neighbor. There are things that I can't do that are morally fine around certain people because it would scandalize them. This is something St. Paul talks about. So there is this, so what I saw was less a desire to be immodest and more a spirit of rebellion. Like, I don't want to be, as they see it, beholden to a man. But that's just one aspect of, I don't want to be beholden to my neighbor.
Yeah, I wonder if the language of scandal and scandalizing might be helpful here. Because I think the argument, or maybe the resistance towards some of the modesty culture, or however you want to put it, is the idea that women should be kind of gatekeepers of men's sexual morality, that somehow if a man looks lustfully at a woman, it's somehow her fault, right? And trying to get away from that idea. So, because I think there is a point there, because when it goes wrong, maybe there is too much of a focus on, women's bodies and not so much on, men's own spiritual agency and moral agency there, right? But at the same time, I think you're exactly right that in the Christian understanding, there has to be sort of a concern for one's neighbor and especially the spiritual health of one's neighbor, right? And I think the scandalized thing is very helpful there. You think about, I don't know, say if you have an alcoholic relative, you're going to alter your behavior around that person, right? Out of charity for them, out of concern for them. So I suppose, I think there's a helpful analogy in here that we can't just simply be concerned about not wanting any sort of double standards. And it also seems like another idea animating this conversation is sort of a resistance to the belief that men and women are different.
Right.
That they have different bodies, but also perhaps different, spiritual weaknesses, right? That in general, say, men are more kind of visually concerned or visually aware of the other sex and that sort of thing. And I think, of course, there are exceptions, but I think it's also helpful to talk about general differences.
Well, it would be disingenuous of me to approach this problem by saying like, oh, we all have responsibility towards our neighbor and not looking at the ways in which it may actually be different for women. But that doesn't mean they don't have the responsibility, but it means they just have to accept, well, we're not all the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed those clips. Abigail has a book on gender coming out from Ignatius Press, so I'm hoping I'll be able to have her back on to discuss that. So now I'm going to play you 3 clips from one of the best episodes I've ever done, episode 28, An Introduction to Meritan's Poetic Philosophy with Samuel Hazel. Here's the description. There is an ongoing and much-needed revival of Jacques Meritan's philosophy of art. Accomplished poet Samuel Hazel makes a most valuable contribution to that revival with The World Within the World, Meritan and the Poet. He wrote the book 60 years ago with a preface by Meritan himself, the only book about him to receive that honor, but it was only recently published. And I'll add, it was published because of the advocacy of our podcast network fellow Mike Aquilina. Continuing the description, in this conversation we go over some of the most important points in Meritan's thought on poetry, Dr. Hazel provides many an illuminating anecdote and off-the-cuff recitation of poems by himself and others to concretize ideas that might to the non-artist seem esoteric. I'm not going to introduce these clips individually. I think they speak for themselves, but just know that you will hear some poetry reading as well as philosophical discussion. Perhaps we could talk about intuition a little bit. And at first, I mean, not creative intuition specifically, but just the intuition in the experience of beauty. We talked about the intellectualized sense. I mentioned the word intuition earlier. I think you mentioned something that Meritan says, that we experience beauty by perception, not judgment, which I think is very important for especially maybe conservative types to not worry so much about having the correct judgment of a work, but experience it through perception instead, because Meritan defines intuition as something that's fundamentally non-conceptual. And that's extremely important for both the person who's taking the art in and the person who's making the art, because the intrusion of concepts have a place sort of orbiting art, but the intrusion into the actual process of concepts can be deadly.
Yeah. Well, it's related primarily to love, finally. I mean, there are things that people intuit because either with other people or with a particular kind of work they're doing, that they intuit it because they love it. And love permits them that kind of knowledge that other people, unloving, cannot have. I mean, even in personal relationships, I know one woman whose husband was about a half foot shorter than she was. And many women asked her, didn't it bother you to marry a shorter man, a man shorter than yourself? And she smiled. She didn't, she wasn't offended. She said, what attracted you to him? She looked at this person and said, I like the look in his eye.
That's great.
And you find that, and I think you find it in intuitions that come through love and that are almost infallible. I mean, people detect things in their own children. For example, my wife, when my son was just maybe a year and a half old, they were sitting there watching Manati's The Little Drummer Boy, I think. And my son just, started tapping. And next year, when he was 3 or 4, she bought him a drum, and then she bought him another drum, and then she bought him a set of drums. And when he went on to the university, he majored in percussion. And it was all because of her perception of the talent in this little baby that I didn't have. I mean, I loved him just as much as she did. But women have this intuition about children that is almost infallible. They know, how shall I say it? I mean, they know the people that love their own children.
Yeah. So what do the emotions come into this? We're talking about intuition. So that means it's not sort of the topic of feeling is unavoidable when it comes to intuition. And yet it's not mere emotionalism. So how does that work exactly?
Well, I don't know how it works, but I do know that if you hear a piece of music that stirs you, there is an emotional response. I mean, you appreciate it because of the feelings that it arouses in you. And the same thing applies to a poem. I was reading a poem of Hopkins the other day, and I'm trying to think of it. Here's the poem. He said, I've desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sighted hail, and a few lilies blow. And I've asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea. If that's not I can't think of a more perfect evocation of retreat than that poem. I have desired to go where springs not fail, to fields where flies no sharp and sighted hail, and a few lilies blow. And I have asked to be where no storms come, where the green swell is in the havens dumb, and out of the swing of the sea. Beautiful.
Yeah. an important thing in the experience of beauty, even for sort of the spectator of a work of art or in nature or wherever you experience beauty, which is going to come up again in the experience of the poet, is that in perceiving beauty, we not only come into contact with things outside ourselves, but it actually simultaneously leads the mind into contact with itself. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I don't know exactly what that means. I do know that sometime let me give you an example. I was walking once in the country, and it was in the evening, it was still light, and I came across a well, and the well began at ground level. And I passed it, and I said, that's interesting. I said, had I come this way when it was dark and passed exactly where I was and kept going, I would not have seen that well. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
And I wrote this poem in reaction to it. It explains pretty much what you think of how eventually the subject that you pick touches something in you that you didn't know was there.
Right.
This poem is called The Silence at the Bottom of the Well. It's been expecting me so long that I feel late. Dropped stones are what it's thirsty for, and I've come armed. I listen to the ghosts of splashes plummet upward like the tired swallow of a heart near death. If I could dunk and hoist a bucket, I would taste what mountain brooks remember of the snow. Instead, I whisper down my name, my name, my name, and listen as it yo-yos in a rounding echo back, back, back. Below the parapet, the swirling walls dive farther down than I can dream, deeper, where night and water meet. The moon of the assassins waits for yesterday and never sleeps.
Meritan uses this Thomistic word, connaturality.
Oh, yes.
To describe intuition and creative knowledge. And I'm glad that you said love there, because that's essentially what it is.
Absolutely.
So in connaturality, knowledge through connaturality means, in a technical sense, it sort of means that, I think, as I understand it, that the mind forms itself to the object that's being contemplated.
That's right, yes.
Which is also another word for definition of truth, the mind's conformity to reality, although that is usually understood in a more rational sense. But what happens with knowledge through connaturality is that the mind goes out to the object, but it also takes the object in and forms itself in a sort of union or likeness, or I think maybe another Thomistic word would be proportion to the object. And I only know this, I haven't read a lot of Aquinas, but I'm mostly getting him via Meritan. But so that is basically the idea of how the mind operates in this kind of knowledge.
It's not something that is willed. It just happened. I was thinking as you were talking of it's not even a story. I think it was a magazine article. He writes about a time he was in Africa and he was hunting or tracking a wounded lion. And he knew exactly where the lion was. And he came and he waited there for the lion to attack him. And he began suddenly to see the world from the lion's point of view. That's something you can't will to do. But he was a hunter, and he knew how lions acted. And
Right.
he tried to, if I were the lion and I knew that this man was coming after me, I would wait and wait, for the right moment. And by the time he finished, you were in the presence of that lion, in the person of that lion. That's connatural.
Wow. That reminds me of this science fiction novel called Ender's Game that's very popular since the 70s. And the concept, part of the concept there is that in order to defeat your enemy, you must love them.
Well, there's a lot to that.
Yeah. So there's a number of ways that knowledge by connaturality functions in human beings. It is how Meritan talks about elsewhere, that this is how mystical knowledge works as well, but they have different objects. But anyway, the difference between poetic knowledge and what you would call knowledge in the normal sense of the word, rational knowledge, is that poetic knowledge tends not towards producing concepts. Meritan talks about the mental word, but towards producing objects, external objects to the mind.
Well, I think that's true, but it is preceded by, and you said it earlier in our conversation, by some kind of intuitive or emotional reaction in the person. I mean, you don't just will yourself to a desk and say, I'm going to write about this that I just imagined. It's
right.
You feel. I mean, you're driven to the pencil, to the pen, or even to just thinking about it. I mean, often when I get a concept of an impulse to write something, I wait, just to make sure this is not just a fly-by-night. If it's still there after a couple of hours and it still has the same effect on me, then I let it have its way with me. But it's a very mysterious process, how words come about, how poems come about. It's really rare. It's hard to describe.
So that seed, that fundamental experience has to be there, but as you just demonstrated, it doesn't have to happen immediately. That seed can be sown, and it could be even more than a couple hours. It could even be years before it actually bears fruit in a work, or it might never, but it is in its nature to tend towards doing so.
I have a book that's coming out, I think, in March, and the title of it is When Not Yet Is Now, and it's based on a very short poem. It goes like this. A week of April Fahrenheit in late February or March is all a crocus needs to sprout and bud. The last defiance it can mount against the likely frost is brazenly to blossom. Waiting to bloom until it's safe to bloom is not for crocuses. They have the courageous impatience to bloom, though many call it folly, whenever they're ready. If they live as crocuses. If not, they die as crocuses.
I love that. And I actually read that yesterday in the catalog sent out by Catholic University Press, actually, because I didn't realize you had a new book of poems coming out until I saw that in the catalog.
Yeah, it's profoundly true to me. I just love things that have the courageous impatience to happen when they want to. I think that's what makes the world go around. That's how poems happen.
CatholicCulture.org is funded almost entirely by user donations. That means everything from our articles on commentary, news, liturgical year stuff on the website, as well as our podcasts and videos. All of those are maintained basically by your generosity. So during this Easter season, we're running a fundraising campaign in which a few of our key donors have generously offered us a $50,000 matching grant. If you, our listeners and readers, can collectively scrounge up $50,000, that amount will be matched by these donors. This fundraising is essential to keep our work going. And by the way, the podcasts really tend to cost a lot more money to make than they take in by way of donation. So I would love to have some of our podcast listeners and YouTube audience get more involved in supporting our work. So to do that, you can go on over to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and your donation will be earmarked specifically for our audio and video content, actually. Yeah, basically all of our podcasts. If now's not the right time for you to make a contribution, then please at least throw us some prayers, and we'll be very grateful for that. The next clip features a Dominican friar, Father Basil Cole, and I had him on very early in the show in episode 11 to talk about music and morals. This clip is from episode 26, also about the relation of art to the moral life. It's called The Arts, Contemplation, and Virtue. The description for this one was very short. Father Basil Cole returns to discuss what he has been teaching the student brothers at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. in a course on the arts, contemplation, and virtue. And in this clip, you will hear him talking about the relation of temperance to the contemplation of art.
I discovered that for St. Thomas, the beautiful virtue above all is temperance. All the virtues are called beautiful by him, but in a special way, temperance is the beautiful virtue. Why? Because it requires a flood of reason into a highly emotional side of one's being, the love of physical pleasure. And he also explains that this is more properly the beautiful virtue because it's the extreme opposite of disgrace and shame that flows from it. He uses a word to describe this kind of a beauty as honestas, which is usually translated honesty, but that's not a pretty good translation. That's good for the beginning. And then the word shame, he outlines what that means psychologically. And then I, go sort of through all of those things. Then I try to show that, the life of virtue is, especially temperance, is the beautiful virtue. From that, then, one could be able to understand how the arts can aid in the process of growing in not only the virtue of temperance, but all the virtues, by reason of the fact that the intellect, the will, and the passions, both the irascible and concupiscible side of the emotions, the moods, all the Thomistic philosophy, they're called passions. Reason, order, is what pervades them and makes them beautiful because reason shines out in acts of the will, acts of prudence, acts of especially temperance, and also reason shines out in courage or fortitude. Getting involved in the arts at an early age, ordinary art and beautiful art, using the word art now to include all of the creations of man that cause beauty, are similar to what we call in prayer sensible consolations that are quite often given to us later on in life if we haven't lived a Christian life very well or lived a sinful life and all the rest of it. And then one day, before the Blessed Sacrament, or if we go to Mass and we read a book, all of a sudden something hits us. I really think I should get back to prayer. I really should get back to Mass. I should really, and then somehow there's a delight that goes into that, this decision. And that delight is akin to the delights of truly good art. Even St. John II and Pope Benedict, in their two beautiful letters on the arts, speak of the arts as having an akin to religion, even though they're not necessarily religious works. But great art, regardless of whether it's religious or not religious, gives one a sense of the transcendence. And so in sensible consolations, before the Blessed Sacrament or at Mass or through a book, is similar to that. You kind of get the sense that somehow God is more than my little puny mind can grasp. Somehow I want to have a relationship with God again that I've kind of thrown away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's possible, however, that people live a strong Christian life from the time they're children until they are adults. And music also has the wonderful capacity to strengthen one's life because it's legitimate, not simply pleasure, but it's a simple delight. And as St. Thomas so clearly states somewhere in the Prima Secundae, where there is reasonable delight, then there is less apt for falling into sins of delight, like lust or drunkenness or other things, drugs and all the rest of those things. And somehow music also becomes a force of sweetening divine teachings. That's a phrase, I believe, from St. Augustine, which explains why we sing the divine office in monastic life or semi-monastic life, or even why they're singing in Mass. It takes dogmas of the faith and makes them a little palatable to the hearing.
But presumably it also is more pleasing to God than simply speaking these things.
It can be more pleasing to God. Yes, it can. I wouldn't say absolutely, because what pleases God is the desire to want to love Him and to serve Him, and the desire to integrate one's life, and the desire to glorify Him. And that can be done outside of music too. There are people who are tone deaf.
Right.
There are people who are not artistic types, but sometimes have tremendous love for God and can't sing very well. Well, that was one of the things St. Joseph taught Jesus, was how to sing. That was what part of St. Joseph's, part of being a father of a family, if you had sons, was to teach your child not only how to read, but how to sing the scriptures, because in the Jewish tradition, everything in the synagogue was usually sung except the discourse by the rabbi, etc.
That's fascinating. I never considered that before.
There's a lot of things St. Joseph did that Jesus nobody thinks about. He's a remote, we're getting off the subject, I know, but he's a kind of a remote preparer of Christ's passion and death. He's not the proximate preparer as Mary was at the foot of the cross, but he's somehow there at the foot of the cross. But that takes us into Josephology, a course which I taught in Rome years and years ago.
The next clip is quite short. It's from episode 27. Always wanted to study the great books? Here's how you'll actually follow through, with Scott Hambrick. Here's the description. Many people want to study the great books of the Western world in a group setting, but are unable to study at a great books college like St. John's, and it's not easy to find people willing to commit to read and meet to discuss the books regularly. I was in that club until I found a new company called Online Great Books. It provides both the books and the people to discuss them with via video conferencing software, all on a schedule that normal, busy folks can keep up with. I want to let people in on the fun I've been having, so I invited OGB founder Scott Hambrick to join me on the show. That's one of the really fun and enticing things about this program, I think, is the sheer variety, the sheer diversity of people who are involved. We hear about diversity constantly, but it's not.
Yeah, they're just talking about what color the people are. They all think the same way. They're just.
Yes, exactly. This is like actual. You've got a prison guy. I remember in the group that I enrolled in. This program's been around for a year and a half now.
About, yep. Yep.
Okay, so I enrolled back in August, and in the group that I enrolled with, there was the larger group that enrolled at the same time as me. There was, I remember, like a prison guard, the guy who described himself as like the towel boy at a car wash. Yep. There's also people who teach at classical schools and artists, and there was a couple TV writers in there, and all these different types of people, and all these weightlifting people, and it's just like such a variety of perspectives, and I find that really valuable, both in terms of the value that it brings to those people who you don't think of as necessarily being involved in an academic environment, which this isn't, and also to everybody else who's in the program, because they're benefiting from that perspective and discussion.
I led a discussion on the Iliad early, before you joined. And, the Iliad is essentially about a war in the Middle East, the Mediterranean at least. And we had an ER nurse in there and an Iraq vet. It was heavy duty. These people bring a whole variety of experiences to these texts, and they then can share the problems that they have with the texts. Because sometimes we just don't agree with them, or we don't like something about them aesthetically or whatever. And they'll bring those complaints or the things that they loved about them and the things that they hate about the book and the thing that they love about the book is colored by their real experience. These are grown, mature people. These aren't high school seniors, although we have some high school seniors. Man, and it'll wreck you. Having an ER nurse and an Iraq vet talking about the Iliad. You can imagine.
Yeah, sure.
We have another gentleman who's in his 80s that he doesn't say very much. But when he does, everybody stops because he's going to bring almost 9 decades of life to bear on something important that one of these great people wrote. I just don't know where the heck else you'd get that unless you were lucky enough to have a granddad or something that had read these things and wanted to sit down and talk to you about it. And that's Joseph. I'm so glad all those people are there.
Yeah, I can hear you getting emotional about it.
Yeah.
So, well, in my group, my seminar is, I think there's the most personal that we've gotten as far as somebody bringing their personal experience to bear on the discussion was one of our guys is a farmer down in Southern Virginia, which I didn't know until we were discussing the Odyssey and talking about the terrain of Ithaca and what kind of animals it was good for raising and what kind of animals it wasn't good for raising. And he was, and we were talking about the swine herd and the goat herd and, what are the characteristics of these different animals and what might have been the associations that, the Greeks had with them. And this guy was talking about, dealing with pigs and, wrestling pigs and all that stuff.
That's fantastic.
Great. So yeah, if you'd like to learn more about online group books, you can check out episode 27. And I'll just note that they renew their enrollment period about every 35 days or so now. So it's really easy to join. And if you'd like to get a discount, you can always use the referral link, which I'll put in the show notes, or go to their website and use the discount code Catholic Culture. And that'll give you 25% off your first 3 months subscription. The last 2 clips in this episode, which I'm going to play back to back, are both from episode 30, What Tolkien's Visual Art Tells Us About His Creative Mind, with John McQuillan and Holly Ordway. You're probably aware that I just interviewed Holly Ordway a few weeks ago about her new book, Tolkien's Modern Reading. Here's the description of episode 30. While Tolkien's brilliance as a world builder and storyteller is well established, fewer people are aware of just how unique and obsessive his creative process was, or that he was a gifted visual artist. That is changing, thanks to an unprecedented exhibition of Tolkien's personal items, manuscripts, and artworks currently on display at the Morgan Library in Manhattan. Unfortunately, you can't see this exhibit anymore because this was in 2019. John McQuillan, assistant curator at the Morgan Library, and Holly Ordway, author of the upcoming study Tolkien's Modern Reading, joined me to discuss the exhibition, which sheds light on Tolkien's use of visual art to help him solidify his literary vision, the role his stories and artworks played in his family life, and perhaps surprising to many who viewed Tolkien as a conservative fuddy-duddy, his willingness to draw on an eclectic range of sources, including distinctly modern ones, to enhance his creative expression. So in these 2 clips, you'll hear John McQuillan talking about Tolkien's surprising visual influences, as well as the importance he placed on developing the geography of his fictional world. Those early watercolors of Tolkien's are so different from his later work, and they're often quite trippy. Do we have any sense of where that was coming from or what influences he may have had? I mean, they're much more sort of avant-garde than you might expect from someone who's known as kind of a stodgy traditionalist.
Indeed. I think a lot of people will be surprised to see how modern they are in their color combinations, in the abstract design. Tolkien as modernist is a topic that is soon to be covered. But I think it shows, someone who was very much of his day. He was not an antiquated thinker or dreamer. He very much lived in his time. Later on, in some of the Hobbit illustrations, you see clear references to sort of, Art Nouveau, Tiffany-esque patterns, but not direct quotations necessarily. His journal patterns, there are elements that he draws from published sources. The great eagle illustration in The Hobbit, the eagle is taken directly from a natural history book and an illustration of an eagle in that. But then other elements he kind of cobbles together from his own interest in patterns, in design,
plant forms.
Plant forms. He was I think, if not an English philologist, he would have been a botanist. He was so interested in the natural world.
John, there's quite a bit of material in the exhibit related to sort of the practical logistics of putting together a work as complex geographically and chronologically as The Lord of the Rings. There's a number of ways that Tolkien organized that, and with things like maps and timelines. So can you talk about that a bit?
Tolkien was always very clear in his practice, particularly, or maybe especially only so, for Lord of the Rings. and stated that he began with a map and made the story fit. Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings is not a narrative that creates space. It was a physical space that had narratives within it. And so the geography was always first and foremost to Tolkien in the creation of Middle-earth. The story originally for Lord of the Rings was supposed to be a sequel to The Hobbit, another of Bilbo's adventures called The Magic Ring. This very quickly changed as Tolkien started writing, and it became what we know it to be. But his process was not necessarily linear. He did not have the ending planned out when he started writing. He wasn't even completely sure where the characters were going or what this story was going to become. And his process in writing was sort of one more of discovery than authorial intent in a way. He was surprised to find Aragorn sitting in the inn at Bree. He was neither sure what Bree was nor who Aragorn was. He didn't know who Faramir was when he turned a corner and ran into Sam and Frodo. It's a very surprising type of composition. And I think many readers especially, are unaware of sort of, in some ways, Tolkien, is discovering the story along with the reader as he produced it. But that being said, there are elements of sort of plan in his process. He had ideas of the Ent Treebeard early on. And so there are notes, and we have a page exhibition that shows this, where Frodo meets Treebeard and is surprised when he leans against a tree and the tree moves, but hasn't yet discovered that Treebeard is in league with Sauron. This idea, of course, is not what comes to pass, and it's Merry and Pippin who meet Treebeard, who is, of course, a force for good rather than evil. And there are aspects in Tolkien's plan as the Fellowship fractures and the narrative for Lord of the Rings gets very chronologically and geographically complex. Tolkien started creating graph timelines for all the different characters and what they were doing on the same day, specific days, so that he could keep the chronological veracity of the story intact. And so there are, I think, about over a dozen of these sort of charts planning out the narrative so that on, the same given day, he knows where Gandalf is, Merry and Pippin, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, and Frodo and Sam, as well as the orcs, all the different characters, so that particularly important for Sam and Frodo, when they look up and see, the phase of the moon at night, it's the same one that Aragorn is looking up from Minas Tirith to see. It's that sort of that deep truth to the world that he was planning out to maintain, at a very, in some ways superficial, but very basic level, the complete veracity of that world. It is, for him, a real world. And so that kind of truth had to be maintained. The maps that he has, that we have in the show and that he produced for Lord of the Rings, are all done to scale. They have a grid line over them with demarcations of, the squares being 100 miles square, 200 miles square, to keep track even of the actual amount of distance that any character could travel on a given day. And he states that he never made any character travel more than he physically could, and tries to work out exactly how far a hobbit could travel. If they are half the size of a man, down to the hobbit measurements of from a toenail up to a hobbit mile, how big are these things? And when he says, that Sam and Frodo have to travel X amount in a day, could they actually do that? The same, of course, goes for Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, Gandalf. All the characters have to maintain that physical truth. And I don't think there's any other writer of fantasy or fiction that quite goes to that depth in maintaining the absolute truth of their world.
I think that's one of the things in which Tolkien has been often imitated, but never matched even close, because I think a lot of fantasy authors have wanted to have the effect, but haven't been willing to put the work in to achieve it. And so you get the sort of veneer, but it's only about a quarter of an inch thick. Whereas with Tolkien, it goes all the way down.
Yeah, I was talking to one of the guys I live with about this last night, and he said, a lot of fantasy authors who have come after, who have tried to do world building, have only done it to the extent that maybe Lord Dunsany did it, where they're not really too concerned about the consistency of the details. They're throwing things in to be evocative, whereas Tolkien already had these things worked out, and then he hints at them in Lord of the Rings without telling you everything. But he actually does have it worked out to a certain degree. Not all of it. He continues to work things out in letters and things like that when people ask him questions. Now, I deeply sympathize with those who regret that they never got to attend this exhibit. It was certainly one of the great highlights of my life as a Tolkien fan. But you know what? There is a really good substitute for that, and that is the exhibition book, Tolkien, Maker of Middle-earth by Catherine McElwain. You can get that for $50 on Amazon, and if you're a big Tolkien fan, I highly recommend it. It's a really, really wonderful book. Not only does it have all of the artwork and manuscript images included in the exhibition and more, it's also got a number of really lovely essays and commentary in there. All right, I hope you enjoyed this clip show. I certainly enjoyed going back and listening to some of these old episodes. But the next one will be a new interview. I'll be talking to Michael Pekalik about his new translation of the Gospel of John, which highlights the role that our Blessed Mother played in the composition of this gospel. So God bless you, and I'll see you next time.